Welcome to Module 1, History of Bilingual Education. The designers of this module are Dr. Hamza and Dr. Proctor, and I will be your instructor. The learning objective is to develop an understanding of the chronology and purposes of language teaching and learning in the United States. So we were going to be focusing roughly on 4 eras: the early 1800s, the late 1800s to the mid 1900s, and then from the mid 1900s to the late 1900s, and finally from the 1900s to the present days. So we'll be looking at 2 populations, the Native Americans and the immigrants. And we will be thinking about what is the purpose of language education, and also who had control or governance of that education. So it's important to note that this discussion is not a comprehensive history. It provides an overview on the Native Americans and immigrant language instruction. There are other resources in Canvas on other important topics. So for example, we do not present the history of colonization or the language education of other colonized people, such as Puerto Ricans or Hawaiians, and we're not including the languages of African slaves in the United States. They were excluded from all type of education for many years, and by the time of emancipation, English was already provided in English. And also users of American Sign Language are not included in this discussion, and Anglo-American or English speakers are considered only within the context of learning a foreign language, and then later within the context of their participation in dual language programs. So we'll begin with a look at Native American education. So pre-contact, before colonization, European exploration, and genocide, there were 300 different indigenous languages in the United States. In terms of the purposes of governance of North American Indian education, this was mostly social, vocational, and spiritual. And the students learned about responsibilities to their extended family and to the group, the clan, through vocational education, home management, farming, hunting, fishing, and so forth. And each tribe had its own religion that told the children what was their place in the cosmos through stories and ceremonies. And in terms of who controlled or governed the education, it was the tribe itself. So it was members of the extended family teaching children through example, and children copied through activities. So there was no formal schooling the way we think about it in today's context. As the language of colonized forces impacted the Native Americans, they made their instruction, the Native Americans made the instruction available both in English and in their native tongue. So while linguists do not agree in the details, it seems like mostly they agree that the Native American languages were oral, and many agree that the first one to be written down was Cherokee, due to the fact that Sequoyah single-handedly invented the writing system, a syllabary system, which included the graphizing all the sounds into an orthography. So this writing system spread widely throughout the Cherokee tribes. So you see here a bilingual English Cherokee newspaper from the 1800s. Well, this complicated and disturbing history of the relations between the Native Americans and the colonizers, it goes beyond this course. It is important to know that by the end of the 1800s, Native American school systems were eradicated. It was through mission schools, through the US government English schools in reservations, and the government-controlled Bureau of Government Affairs boarding schools. They all contributed in eradicating the Native American schools and their language. So let's take a look at the boarding schools. The Bureau of Indian Affairs boarding school movement required that the Native American children were removed from their communities and attend boarding schools where the use of English of their own language was prohibited, and they were instructed in English. And there were reports that they were even punished for using native tongues. So this is, or languages. So this is the Carlisle School is one example, and it consisted on half day of vocational school and a half day of academic instruction in English. So Richard Pratt, the Army captain, said that the goal of education was their assimilation of the Native Americans. In his speech from the 1800s, he said, "Let's kill the Indian and save the man." These schools were criticized during the era of progressive education because the vocational training was seen as work just to support the schools in order to save the government some money. Due to the influence of this progressive education movement during the early to mid 1900s, there was a shift away from the boarding school approaches, though some continued into the mid 20th century. However, as this bilingual text illustrates, the way in which the native languages and English was used is notable, how it was used just to speed the understanding of modern life and to be able to learn English faster. So it was said that the use of the native language was to, quote, speed up the acquisition of English. So during this time, it was still assimilation and the suppression of their own language to be replaced by English. It's important to note that throughout this time, Native Americans served in World War I and then World War II. In fact, the fascinating story of the Navajo code talkers underscored not only their commitment to the United States, but also the value of their language to the war effort. The Navajo language provided a code that was impossible for the other forces to break, and it was the basis for secret wartime communication. In the post-World War II era, Native American education was influenced by the United Nations effort for colonized people to chart their own destinies and the US civil rights movement. All this resulted in efforts to reconnect Native Americans with their home languages and cultures through schooling that was controlled by the Native Americans and not by the US government. These efforts, which, as we will see in future modules about legal actions, eventually led to current trends where Native American groups are reclaiming and regenerating their languages through programs where they use their modern tongue, through programs where there's revitalization of their language and reversal of language shift. So some examples include the Wampanoag Language Reclamation Project, the Cherokee Immersion School, and our own from the Twin Network, the Red Cloud Lakota, as well as others. As 2010 MacArthur Fellow Jesse Little Doe Bird said, reclaiming our language is one means of repairing the broken circle of cultural loss and pain. To be able to understand and speak our language means to see the world as our families did for centuries. It's interesting to note that while issues of control and purpose for Native Americans are being resolved, there are technical and curriculum challenges to consider. Here we see the efforts taken by the Cherokee to include Cherokee font in smartphones and computers, and Navajo schools also voicing the concern that the current generation of Navajo children enters school using Navajo as second language due to decades of and generations of language loss and shifts. So before we shift into dual language educations, that bilingual education for immigrants is a good moment to pause and think about how Native American populations live through this language shift, and also on the chronology and purposes of language teaching and learning. Now we will turn our attention to language education and the immigrant children. The US has a history of both colonization and immigration, and it's important to be aware of the historical trends of immigration in order to understand how language is implicated in the instruction of the immigrants. So while the study of immigration as a whole is beyond the scope of this course, we did include some resources in Canvas. The early colonists were European, and most of them were British. And by the time of the first census in 1790, most non-native US residents were English, Irish, and of German descent. Note that in these charts, enslaved African people were likely not counted as immigrants. So here we can see how the number of immigrants varied over time. In this chart, we can see overall most immigrants originated from Europe. I used information from a teacher-friendly website published by Scholastic in case it's helpful in your work. As this third chart shows, the trends of places of origin have shifted throughout different eras. And the readings in Canvas explain patterns of immigration and how they were impacted by laws as well as other influences. It's important to note that the immigrants brought their own languages with them to the US. Language diversity was the reality of the early years of the US. In fact, it was a German language newspaper that first included the American Declaration of Independence. English readers had to wait a day later to read the English text in the Pennsylvania News. So as early as July 6, translations of the Declaration of Independence were available in other languages. The bottom one shows one of the few existing copies in German. Language diversity continued from the beginning onward. Newspapers have been continuously available in many languages, as seen here in these examples. In terms of education, where there were high concentrations of particular language groups, there tended to be instruction in that language. So here you can see the German population in areas of German density. Here are examples of German language instructional resources: reading, arithmetic, a reading text, a report card in German, and a penmanship notebook. However, it was not just the German immigrants who provided bilingual education. Dual language instruction or non-English instruction was offered in more than a dozen states. Languages included German, Swedish, Norwegian, Danish, Dutch, Polish, Italian, Czech, and French, and Spanish. It was at the beginning of the 1900s that the sentiment against languages other than English, and German in particular, began to arise. The term hyphenated Americans was first published in 1889, and it was common as a derogative term by 1904. Anti-German sentiment was strong, and it spread to other language groups as well. and further the suppression of language other than English in many regards. World War I affected dual language programs and foreign language programs in the US. Former President Theodore Roosevelt denounced hibernate Theodore Roosevelt denounced hyphenated Americans, insisting that dual loyalties were impossible during wartime. In Iowa in 1980, Babel Proclamation, 1918, the government prohibited all foreign languages in schools and in public places. And the response of German Americans to these tactics was to Americanize their names. So for example, we have Müller to Miller, etc. And the Germans also they collaborated with the US to stop the use of German in public places, including churches. Language suppression, however, impacted the US war efforts in World War II. So the native, we saw how the Navajos helped during the Second World War. So during this time, the US armies began to see as very important the language of modern languages. So they would select army recruits and immerse them in languages. So between this language understanding and behavioral understanding, derived into an audiolingual method of instruction where the military was able to understand the language of other foreign countries in the war. So there were different influences by the time of the mid-1800s. We're going to look at the Cold War influences. Sorry, this repeats a little bit of what I said. We're going to look at the international Cold War with the Soviet Union, the immigrants from Cuba, and then the domestic influences, the civic rights and the legislation and Supreme Court decisions in the United States. In October of 1957, the Soviet Union launched the first satellite called Sputnik, and it had a huge impact and propelled the United States to consider changes in education. This included an increased focus on foreign language skills because these were, again, seen as an important part of national security and national defense. Foreign language programs were being introduced and reestablished in schools based on the funding provided by the National Defense Education Act. At the same time, there were international pressures that resulted from the Cuban Revolution, the Cuban Missile Crisis. This resulted in a tremendous influx of Cuban exiles and refugees to Florida. The impact of the Cuban exiles in Miami was great in terms of foreign language or second language education, because the Cuban immigrants founded the first bilingual schools and programs. And this is a choral bilingual program. This is a picture of that first bilingual program in the country. At this time, the civil rights movement had an impact on language rights. So during this time, we not only had school desegregation, but also in East LA, there was a walkout where Latinx students demanded educational student justice. And it was also a time where the American Indian movement was advocating for rights, including language rights. And we can see also this was the case of Puerto Ricans represented in New York City, represented by the Young Lords movement. Here it is. And all these groups found power among political or legal groups. So it became very relevant. So these pressures resulted in legislations and Supreme Court decisions. It greatly influenced the teaching and learning through other languages. So we have the Education and Secondary Education Act, which included the Title VII, called the Bilingual Education Act from 1965. And also the Supreme Court decision, which was huge, Lau versus Nichols, a group of Chinese students in San Francisco that sued the district because they were not being served. And we will talk about it later. So we can see that there was this variety of elements that affected language and learning in other languages. So by the mid-1900s, there was a lot happening, and it all expanded into opportunities for language and learning. So all of these influences combine to have an impact in bilingual and dual language education and modern language study. So in terms of bilingual education, we see that these forms of education grew throughout the US from the 1970s through the 1990s. And as we will see in Module 3, some forms were arrested in the late 1990s through to legislation in several states. Other forms have had a resurgence since the 1900s into the 2000s. And modern language study, also known as foreign language, grew rapidly in the 1960s and 1970s, and then decreased toward the end of the 20th century. So by the end of the 1900s, there was some common models of bilingual and dual language education, including transitional bilingual education, developmental bilingual education or maintenance bilingual programs, one-way immersion or modern language immersion, heritage language programs, and two-way immersion or dual language immersion. And we'll talk about these modules in Module 2. So this is a good moment to pause and reflect in regard to the chronology and purpose of language teaching and learning in regards to immigrant population. And you can take notes if it helps, or just simply reflect about it and go over some of aspects that we spoke. So from the late 1900s to the present, we have some current tensions. So we have an increase of immigration from non-European countries. We also have a growth in anti-immigrant sentiments. We have current legislation started with the ESSA, No Child Left Behind, and then the anti-bilingual education laws in California, Arizona, and in Massachusetts, as we will see later. At the same time, we've been having a growing acceptance of the benefits of bilingualism and biliteracy, and a growth in the two-way immersion model of bilingual education. Finally, we have a growth in the heritage language programs and language revitalization programs. So we see that we have the sentiments that are driving politics and legislation. We have changing demographics, we have brain science and educational research, and we have cultural identity movements. So all these are pressures that impact our language teaching in our schools. So thinking about the history of bilingual education and who has control and who's governing the schools, it really leads us to see how complex this issue is. You can go to Canvas now for a detailed description of assignment 1 and how you need to submit it. Please contact me if you have any questions. Thank you very much. This concludes our module 1.